I'd like to add a couple of comments to Arvin's introduction about my background. See, I'm kind of a strange animal because I sort of have my feet in two different fields. The one leg is in the NGO movement, where my wife and I have supported things like the Global Ecological Network and the Gaia Education for Sustainability. And my other leg has been in the business world. So my entire professional career has been in the private sector as a management consultant. And then later on in my career, I specialized in finance, international finance, and currency markets in particular. So I have this strange background that maybe gives me a special way of looking at problems in the world. So I was, in a way, an insider in the financial world for about 25 years. And finally got out of it and decided to tell the rest of the world what's actually happening. And this is what my book is all about. Now, you notice the title, Occupy Wall Street. I'm sure some are wondering, where does this title come from? Well, I'm sure you've all heard of the Occupy movement, right? Is there anyone who hasn't heard about the Occupy movement? No. But what happened was my book was actually being written over a period of about 6 or 7 years, and was going to press around October, November last year, when the Occupy movement suddenly broke onto the international scene. And my publisher, Chelsea Green in Vermont, called up and said, "Ross, maybe we should change the title of your book." At that time, we were going to call it The Breakaway Strategy, which I'll come back to later, which is still part of the book. But she suggested, "Ross, why don't we call it Occupy Wall Street?" Because this is what the book is really all about. It deals with all of the issues that are raised by the Occupy movement, but not just at the national level, but at the global level. And to make it even more interesting, I'm suggesting solutions and not just identifying problems. So that was the background for the title of the book. Now the first slide I'd like to show you. I'd like to show you this slide, which illustrates very concisely what the Occupy movement is all about. You see two charts here, and at the top we see the increase in income in 5 different categories in the United States in the period, this is in the period 1950 to 1978. Notice how all 5 of these fractals, they had fairly uniform increases in income, with actually the largest increase occurring to the lowest 20%. Okay? This is the way the world was functioning after the Second World War until around 1980. Now look at the lower diagram. This is showing the similar numbers for the period 1979 to 2005. This is the so-called Neoliberal Period. Here we see that the lowest 20% only had an increase of 1%, while the top 1% had an increase of 200%. And this is what the Occupy movement is all about. This is why they're saying we are the 99%, and it's the 1% which has been getting all the benefits. In fact, if we go up to the top 0.1%, the amounts are just staggering. I mean, 390% increase in income for the people who are already the wealthiest people in the United States. Now, this kind of skewed distribution is totally unsustainable. I mean, historically speaking, it's almost always led to revolutions of one kind or another. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we can identify that something very significant happened around 1980. That's a point I'd like to make very clear. I'll show you some examples of some of the things that have happened since 1980. First, here are a couple of diagrams to illustrate how the financial sector in the United States shifted after the period of around 1980. Notice the top diagram is showing the total compensation growth of companies in the financial sector, that's the red line, as opposed to everyone else, the black line. And you see until sort of around 1980, they were pretty much increasing in parallel. And then suddenly a significant shift occurred where the financial sector began to earn substantially more than the rest of the economy in the US. Similarly, if you look at the lower diagram, This is showing the ratio of chief executive pay to the average worker in the United States, going back to 1960. And we see that the period, the left hand of the diagram from 1960 to 1980 is fairly flat. And it's at a ratio of around 40:1. Okay, the CEO. These are for the largest companies in the US, the Standard & Poor Index companies. But after 1980, we see a phenomenal increase in the salaries of the top executives, which went from 40:1 to, in 2000, over 500:1. I mean, this is just enormous. They are simply grabbing a greater and greater portion of the earnings in their companies. This fell back after the dot-com crisis of 2000. We see it fell back, and again after the crisis, it came a little later. But on the whole, you could say that even today, you know, we're talking about numbers that are well over 300:1. So these three diagrams I've just shown you here really are illustrating why the Occupy movement is in such an uproar. Now I'm going to show you three different areas that have been affected since 1980, very substantially different from what was happening before, in the social area, in the area of the environment, and the area of the economy. And all of these three areas, which are generally considered to be the most important areas of our culture, our country, significant things were happening. Later on, I'll come back and explain what it was that caused this change. Here, the first diagram is in the social area. This diagram is showing the so-called Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality. The higher the Gini coefficient, the more the inequality. So in the period, you can have the left part of the diagram, you can't perhaps read all the numbers, but that's roughly to 1980. Things were fairly flat, maybe increasing slightly. And then we see a dramatic increase in inequality occurring after 1980. And this is an average of all countries in the world, not just the United States. In fact, if we look at individual countries within each country, we see a very similar trend occurring. So the gap between the rich and the poor, you could say, has been increasing both between the rich and poor countries and within individual countries. Now let's look at the area of the environment. Here again, we see again a very dramatic increase in something. What is it we're measuring here? Well, this is the so-called ecological footprint. This is a fairly widely used measure of the impacts of humanity on the environment. The green line at the level of 1.0 corresponds to one planet. In other words, this is the amount of biocapacity that the planet has to support human life and other kinds of life, because we have to live from the plants and the animals on the planet. And so the red line is showing us what percentage, or what fraction of that one planet have we been using throughout the last 100 years or so. Actually, it goes back only, in this case, to about 1960. But notice once again that once we got into the 1980s, we hit the point where the red curve and hit the green curve. That means this is the point at which we were actually using 100% of what nature was providing in terms of photosynthesis from the sun, the plants, the animals, everything we're living from. Since then, it's continued to increase, and today it's up at about 1.4 planets, which means that on a global scale, we're actually consuming more than nature can provide. And you might ask, well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible. If we look at the individual components in this measure, the area in which the greatest increase has occurred over this period is in the so-called sinks of our waste products. Where does the waste go? And in particular, where does the carbon dioxide go that we're producing from burning fossil fuels? And it's going in the first place to two places. It's going into the oceans, which is creating more and more acidity and destroying a great portion of marine life by being dissolved in the oceans. And the rest of it is being absorbed in the atmosphere and causing the well-known global warming problem. So we've been, in a sense, creating disaster situation for ourselves by filling up the ocean and filling up the atmosphere with CO2. We don't see the immediate results of this. But in fact, even if we do nothing, the temperature is going to continue increasing now for some time. So this is an example of how we are, if you like, living beyond our means. And this, by the way, is an average for all countries, the whole planet. If we look at individual countries, like the United States and Europe, the wealthiest countries, we're up to a much higher level. In fact, if every country in the world was to have the same impact in terms of ecological footprint as the United States, or Europe for that matter, we'd need roughly 3 to 4 additional planets. That's how much the rich countries are consuming. It should be clear from this that there's no way, absolutely no way, that the developing countries will ever reach the level of consumption that we have here in the West. Never. It's an impossible thought. I mean, there's just no way that kind of consumption is going to be possible. The whole system will have to break down before that ever happens. Now we look at the third sector. This is the economic sector. Now here again we have two diagrams, two curves rather. The upper curve is showing the gross domestic product in the United States from the period 1950 to 2002. You see a pretty steady increase. The lower curve is called the genuine progress indicator. And what it does is it subtracts from the gross domestic product all the negative things. You see, gross domestic product is a measure of total activity, of total income. It does not distinguish between what may be a positive or negative contribution to our well-being. So it might include such things as cleaning up the pollution after major accidents like we saw in Japan and in Fukushima, and we saw in the Mexican Gulf with the BP and so forth. It includes things like increased traffic accidents, additional hospital care, many other negative aspects of growth. And when we deduct the negatives from the positives, to our great surprise, we find out that our actual well-being, which is measured by the lower curve here, has been pretty flat since about 1980. In fact, it's been falling slightly. And this is for the United States, okay? But similar analyses have been done on several other countries, including the UK, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, I believe. So we see the same pattern everywhere. So in other words, in a way, we have been very negligent in continuing to use gross domestic product as a measure of well-being. That's not what it measures. In fact, economists will say, well, it was never intended to be to measure well-being. But the problem is that most people don't realize this. Politicians don't realize it. Journalists don't realize it. Even economists who maybe realize it don't bring it to our attention. So we continue to use the gross domestic product as a measure of how well we're doing. What is your government talking about? What's going to happen next year? Are we going to have an increase of 0.8% or 1.2% in gross domestic product? That's what the whole discussion is about when you make your finance law budget each year, right? But what about the net well-being? Nobody asks that question. Well, one country does, actually, Bhutan. Bhutan has adopted what they call Gross National Happiness Index, which actually tries to deduct the negatives from the positive. They're the only country in the world that does that. So, let's go back to my question I put to you before. What is it that happened around 1980 that caused all these significant sudden shifts in these three areas? Social, ecological, and economic. Well, the common thread is what we can call the worldview. It's the way we look at the world. And the worldview that has been dominating in this period is based on what I call Neoliberal Economics. This is a new philosophy which did not exist before 1980, roughly. Certainly not in the mainstream. There were perhaps a few very fringe, marginalized economists that had these ideas, but they were considered sort of wackos, way out. But nevertheless, during the 1980s, they got into power, especially under President Reagan in the USA. And their basic philosophy was that if you have complete freedom of goods, free flow of goods, the free flow of capital, deregulation of corporations, and the privatization of publicly owned utilities, this will benefit everyone. Everyone. The rich, the poor, everyone. This was the philosophy. Well, we can see what actually happened. What actually happened was the promoters, they're the ones that got all the benefits. It shouldn't surprise anyone. In fact, the economist Karl Polanyi, back in 1944, wrote a very good book called The Great Transformation. And in that book, he made an interesting statement. He said, if we give the corporate sector complete freedom to do whatever they please, they will not only destroy the environment, they will destroy man himself. And that is basically what we've been doing for the last 30 years. Destroying the environment and destroying ourselves. We're on a suicide path right now. If we continue, we can't just continue consuming 40% more globally than nature can provide. And that is increasing every year by about 2%. So neoliberal economics is a philosophy that's intended to benefit the most wealthy, and it's dominating the whole planet. Profits trump investment. That's the basic idea. And now, just as a kind of a sidelight, this is really a separate problem which we're facing pretty soon, just to make things even more complicated. Don't worry, I'm going to get to the good news a little later. But here, another thing ahead of us is this whole question of oil. If we look at the production of oil historically, in a geological sense, it's really a short-lived resource which is available to us as a species, covering a period of maybe roughly 200 years, from about 1850 to 2050. We're right now sitting at the very top of this peak. That's why it's called peak oil. What that means is that the total amount of oil that we can produce all over the globe is close to a maximum right now, and we know with absolute certainty that it's going to go into decline. What we don't know is exactly when. And there are a number of different estimates by various experts. And more recently, the development of so-called shale gas and the tar sands of Alberta in the United States and Canada may very well postpone that peak. The experts 10 years ago, they thought it was going to happen right about now, or maybe even before this. But now it looks like it's going to be postponed a little bit, which is both good and bad, because on the good side, it means it gives us a little more time. And the bad news, of course, is that the more fossil fuels we burn up, the more likely we are to destroy the climate and ourselves in the process. But that's just another problem on top of all the others. So, there's both good news and bad news. The good news is that all over the world there is a shift in the worldview occurring. I call it a paradigm shift. The old paradigm, the one which has existed for roughly 400 years, has been based on the idea that man is separate from nature. That nature is considered basically resources to be exploited. And this is what we've been doing. It's also based on a reductionist idea that we can reduce complex problems into small, manageable, linear problems. And so this has been a tremendous advantage in the development of modern science. And it's been a major explanation for the tremendous increase we've seen in our standard of living, this explosion of science in this period. But it's also been causing problems, as we're now realizing, and many of these problems were not foreseen. I mean, who could imagine, say, 100 years ago, that burning oil was going to possibly be a threat to humanity 100 years later due to climate change? And nobody had imagined that. What other surprises may be in store? We don't know. What we do know for sure is that we don't understand the ecosystem. It's a very complex, non-linear system with many, many feedback loops. And so if we start messing around with it in one area, it's going to react maybe somewhere completely different. This is what happened with burning fossil fuels, and it could happen in many other ways. We just don't know. And so we're taking a tremendous chance by experimenting this way. The bad news, on the other hand, is that we have developed a system, a global system, which is very, very rigid. That's what I call the structural problem. And to illustrate this, I think it's best to look at what's happening in the United States. The United States has been more or less taken over by what I call the corporatocracy. This is not my word. This is a word which was actually coined by John Perkins, who wrote a very fascinating book called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. How many here have ever read that book? I can really recommend it because it gives the true story about what's been happening with the World Bank in particular and exploitation of the developing countries. He was one of them that was hired to do that. But the corporatocracy is his word for the large American corporations and their very wealthy shareholders. Basically the people who are behind the whole neoliberal project, which has been now running for about 30 years. And the frightening thing is that they've used that wealth to purchase political power. So today, the larger corporations in the United States completely control not only the military and industrial complex, which they already did back in Eisenhower's time, but since then they've taken control of the media, they've taken control of the financial sector, and most damaging of all, they've taken control of Congress. Through new campaign finance laws in the United States fairly recently, the Supreme Court backed up the idea that corporations have so-called personhood, just like people, and therefore they have the right to free speech, and therefore they have the right to, just like any individual, to use unlimited amounts to support political candidates. But you know what that means? It means no political candidate is going to be elected against their money, and particularly not re-elected. Some might get elected, but they're certainly not going to get re-elected because their opponents are going to get support from the corporatocracy. So I would say today, it would be no exaggeration to say that the United States is no longer a democracy. You know, one of the leading world experts on democracy is David Held, an English emeritus professor from the London Business School, who has said about democracy that it creates a favored position for the corporate sector, which biases the results in favor of what are the interests of big business. And why is that? Well, we imagine that democracy means that everyone has one vote, right? That's the whole idea of democracy. But that's not the way it works in practice. In practice, particularly we saw in the United States, but it's true elsewhere as well, the big money is the one who decides who gets elected in many, many, many cases. And not only that, but between elections, who is it that the politicians talk to when they're considering new legislation? Well, it's business groups like the Round Table and these other organizations of large corporations. They're the ones that are called in for their opinions. So we have a problem here, a very significant problem. How do you create reform in a situation where the people who are at the top and are making decisions are not interested in any change? I mean, one thing is to say, let's raise awareness, let's tell them what's happening, let's tell them that we have to do something. But what if their attitude is, we don't care? As long as we stay in charge, the rest of you can do whatever you like. We don't care. That's the problem, what I call the structural problem we're facing when we're trying to talk about solutions. I've illustrated it here in this diagram. I call it the contemporary world order. It's a very simplified diagram, but it gives the essence. And what we have at the top is this corporatocracy, basically an American phenomenon, but they control the US Congress and the US administration. They don't directly control other countries, but they do, in fact, indirectly, through all kinds of alliances and through intimidation of client states in various ways. And the tools which enable them to do this are the WTO, that's the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Of course, they also have the military power of NATO behind them. But it is these three institutions to the left which basically are the so-called international institutions which enable this neoliberal philosophy to be implemented in practice. And what it really is these are an extension, basically, of American interests. Nobody makes any major decision in these three institutions against the interests of the United States, even though they don't have an absolute majority of the vote. In practice, that's the way it works. So here at the bottom, we have 7 billion world citizens who have very little to say about what's going on, even in America. The 300 and some million Americans that also have a vote don't have much to say either about what's going on. So this is what we're facing. If we want to talk about solutions, this is the sort of situation we have to take as a given. And this connection, I might just mention, most of the people around the world who are trying to create reform, and that would include organizations like the ones we've worked with, the Global Ecological Network, Gaia Education, but also organizations like 350.org and Greenpeace, and Friends of the Earth. All of these, they're basically advocacy organizations. Some of them are single issue, some of them are broad. But the whole point is what they're trying to do is to affect the political decisions at the top by making them more aware of the kind of problems that we're facing. But if the people at the top don't care, then what good is all this advocacy doing? And if we look back, in fact, over what's been happening, if you go back to even in the 1960s, we were being warned about these problems by Rachel Carson, by the Limits to Growth study, which came out in '72, and many, many others. And yet nothing has happened. There's been no reaction. In 1992, a group of the world's leading scientists, including many Nobel Prize winners, wrote an appeal to the world's politicians to say, we have to do something, and we have to do it quickly, because we're on a very, very dangerous path globally. Then in '92, we had the United Nations Environmental Conference, which a lot of lovely declarations were made, but there were no real commitments. Here last June, 20 years later, we had Rio plus 20. It was even worse than '92. I mean, there were absolutely no commitments from politicians. We were there, Hildur and myself, and our NGO friends had put forward a long list of suggestions. One of the ones at the very top was that, well, the least we can do, they said, is to stop giving subsidies to the burning of fossil fuels. You know how much money is given in subsidies to burning fossil fuels globally? $775 billion every year. $775 billion. It's more than 10 times all of the foreign aid given to the developing countries. So that's what we're up against, okay? So what is my suggestion for a solution? First of all, what I'm saying is we have to change the economic system. We have to remove neoliberalism and introduce something else, which I use the expression Gaian economics, which is actually, it refers to two things. On the one hand, it refers to the fact that we give the environment top priority, ecology first, economy second. But it's not enough. It's not enough just to change the economic system unless we also change the institutions. Because you cannot introduce ecological economics into the current system of the WTO, IMF, and World Bank because they're not designed for that. They're designed for exploitation. They're designed to keep the developing countries as suppliers of cheap raw materials, basically. They're designed to keep mostly the developing countries in a deep debt, to be obligated to the United States and their allies whenever they need votes in the UN, whenever they need new military bases and so forth. That is the way the world is working. So we have to have new institutions which replace those three. So what is the model that I envisage could be the ideal solution? I'm saying what we do, what I would consider to be an ideal solution, we'll come back to the practical aspects later, it would be a world in which we have to cooperate certainly in one particular area, and that's in the area of environmental protection. This is the one area where we have to cooperate internationally because of the magnitude of the problems, things like global warming in the oceans and so forth, And we have to do it by respecting human rights, because we don't want a solution which is a totalitarian solution. So these are the two things I'm saying that nation states have to secede to some kind of a central authority. But I believe that everything else, including foreign policy, trade policy, and so forth, should be decentralized to the individual countries to do as they please, so that they take control of their economies, they take control of their own priorities. And as long as they stay within the restrictions here, in other words, accepting directives on sustainability and human rights, then in my model, they can do what they like. They could be capitalist, they could be socialist, they could be religious. It doesn't matter, as long as they stay within the bounds. After all, our whole human civilization is based on the idea of many, many different cultures. I don't think we want to destroy them. I think we want to keep them, and cherish them. And we do this by giving them maximum independence and maximum freedom to choose their own priorities. So this is what I'm saying is the ideal solution, and this is a non-ideological. I'm not saying this is a capitalistic society or a socialist. I'm saying that it is about survival. Okay? It's about the species lasting indefinitely. So what I'm proposing in my book, and I won't be able to go into this in any detail here, maybe we can go into more detail in the question period. I'm proposing a number of new institutions to replace the WTO and IMF. And I'll just mention some of the highlights here now. An important one is the trade organization. In other words, we have to reverse the rules in the WTO. The WTO, just to give you a couple of examples, the WTO as it is today is the biggest barrier to sustainability of any of these organizations. Why is that? Well, supposing you're a country, you're maybe the president or prime minister of your country, and you say, we want to go ahead, we want to be a leader, we want to be sustainable, and we give directives to our major corporations. We say, you're going to have to live up to higher environmental standards from now on. Well, what happens? Well, the big corporations say to the politicians, well, if you do that, we won't be able to compete against our foreign competition. We may even have to leave. That's in fact what corporations are saying every time the politicians suggest anything like that. But why don't the politicians say, okay, well, we'll put tariffs on foreign products so that we have a level playing field, okay? Well, I'm sorry, but you can't do that in the WTO. That's not allowed. Point two, the WTO has another interesting rule. It says to the developing countries, you may not give any benefit to any domestic company that you do not give to a foreign company. Well, guess what? That's a guarantee that they will never develop into an industrialized country. Because the only way any country has ever industrialized, and there are no exceptions to this rule, is through protectionism. Protection of their industries until they become competitive. And so if you go to a developing country today and say you mustn't do the same, you mustn't do what we did. That's what we're saying basically. Then you're forcing them to remain undeveloped. And that's precisely what the neoliberals want, because the standard of our living in the West could never be maintained without such a system. You know, they're supplying us with all the cheap raw materials. They're competing with each other with all kinds of basic products, food products, minerals products, competing with each other to say who can give the West the cheapest, best offer. That's the way the system is working. So we need a new trade organization which says no more free flow of goods, no more free flow of capital. We're taking back charge of our economies. Another suggestion I have is something called a clearing union. This is actually an idea which was put forth by the British economist John Maynard Keynes back in 1945 as a way of dealing with international trade. A model which basically created a level playing field between countries which have surpluses in their trade and countries which have deficits in their trade. But it was never implemented. Instead, we got an American suggestion, which was a gold-based dollar. And that system lasted only until 1971 when it collapsed. And since then, all the currencies have been basically floating against each other. But this is an idea which can be revived, and I'm suggesting that we should do that, put all currencies on an equal basis from now on, so that you don't have one major currency like the US dollar, which gets special advantages. I'm also suggesting a new kind of development bank. The current development model is basically one of exploitation. As I mentioned, books like John Perkins on the Confessions of an Economic Hitman illustrate this very clearly. Neoliberals do not want to see the developing countries develop. We also have to have a legislative body in this new system. I call it a Congress. This is basically a legislative body with government appointees. Each government sends a delegation, and they have various rules for making resolutions, and any resolution which is adopted, by definition, becomes international law for the members. Today, we don't have any international law which is binding, which has consequences. Then we need a court of justice to interpret the law. We need an executive, that's the commission. We need a resource board. This is the institution which manages resources, because as I said, this central authority has to have a responsibility for environmental protection. So it means, among other things, it can issue directives. They might say, for example, that globally we mustn't emit more than 50 gigatons of CO2 this year. The next year maybe only 10% less than that. In other words, these are the people who would send out those kinds of instructions which the member states would have to follow. And that would not include just things like CO2, it would include all kinds of resources. Things like how do we settle problems of rivers that flow across boundaries and administering the oceans and the rivers and the lakes around the world. All of these resources, minerals, for example, we have to also have a tremendous higher degree of recycling if we want to our future generations to have something to work with. And finally, I have what I call a council. You notice that there's no democracy in this system yet, because my Congress is basically government appointees. That's the only way I think it would work in practice. But how do we put a check on this council? How do we prevent some subgroup of taking control, just the way they took control, say, of the American Congress? Well, we do that, I think, by having a council which is elected, which has one power, and one power only, to veto any resolution by the Congress. And this, I imagine, is a small group of elected, very high integrity individuals from around the world, not a big group, a small group, but people who are recognized for having the kind of integrity and have demonstrated throughout their lives that they actually mean it when they say that they want to stand for what is best for all of humanity. People like Eric Daman, just to make one example, here in Norway. People like maybe Nelson Mandela. You know, these are the kind of people, I think every culture knows who these people are, and they will vote for them. So that is basically, in this very summary way, the structure I'm suggesting. And this gives a completely different kind of world order compared to the one I showed previously. Before we had the 7 billion citizens at the bottom with no influence, and now they're at the top because they're the ones who elect the council. And now we have a Congress and we have a commission and so forth, and we have these various institutions whose job now is primarily to take care of the environment and human rights. That's a very different kind of organization. So then another major question arises here. How do we ever achieve such an accomplishment? How do we go from here to there? And here's where I call it the breakaway strategy. My idea is that initially, we can't just suggest that the United Nations decides to make such a structure. Forget it. You can't have 193 countries sitting around the table talking about a new, especially when one of them is the United States. So I think that this initiative is going to have to come from some of the smaller countries, particularly some of the developing countries, who have realized how dangerous neoliberalism has been for them, and it's cost them so much in terms of their quality of life. But also some of the smaller industrial countries. For example, Norway. In fact, I made a list in my book of 12 countries which I thought had the right kind of profile that might conceivably found such a so-called Gaian League, which would say to the world, we are going to adopt ecological economics as state policy, all the members. And we're going to convert each of our economies to a sustainable economy over a period of years. That is our plan. And you're welcome to join. Everyone's welcome to join. This is not done for the benefit of these 6 or 7 countries. It's done as a model which could work for everyone. And so it's a very altruistic model. And they're offering it to the world and saying, please join us when you're ready. Now, we don't know how the rest of the world's going to react. Initially, they're going to maybe wonder, what is this little group of countries? They have no real power. But actually, they do have a lot of power, because just the very fact that they formed such an organization would be a world-shaking event. I mean, after all, for the first time, you could say, well, there is actually an alternative to the current system, one which focuses on environmental protection, human rights. It's also democratic. People have great freedoms. They have independence, and each country can do what it likes, as opposed to today, where it has ceded its economic decisions to foreign commercial interests. So I think this is a solution where a lot of citizens around the world would say to their leaders, why aren't we a member? Let's join. And this is the idea that we can get civil society, and in fact, the more progressive part of the business community, I think, would back up this idea. Businessmen are not the evil guys in this model. And a lot of people think, well, the corporations are the evil guys because they're making up the corporatocracy. But the fact of the matter is that most corporate executives would have no problem accepting a framework like this as long as it applied to their competitors. And that's the key thing. Right? Today it's impossible to do that in the current structure. Because there's no way you can, as I mentioned previously, under the WTO, you can't create a level playing field with your competitors. It's designed such so that the strongest will always dominate the weak. Yeah. So that's basically what I was going to say in my introductory remarks. And what I'd like to do now is say, okay, let's take a short break. Maybe 15 minutes. I think there's going to be some coffee. And then we'll return and take some questions and have a dialogue. Okay? So thanks for now. Stay with us.